It's May 7, 2008. A 23-year-old woman sits in her car, clutching a small purse and a cell phone that keeps buzzing with nervous texts. Her name is Rachel Morningstar Hoffman. To her friends, she's a quirky, kind-hearted girl with an infectious laugh, a recent Florida State University graduate who loved music or pets and dreamed of a bright future. But on this night, Rachel isn't heading to a party. She isn't meeting friends for dinner. Instead, she is about to walk into a dangerous undercover operation, one orchestrated not by criminals, but by the very police she thought would protect her. Rachel had been caught just weeks earlier with a small amount of marijuana. The charge would have meant probation, or at worst, a few years behind bars. But police presented her with a different choice: work for them as a confidential informant, or face prison time. Terrified and desperate, Rachel agreed. And tonight was her first assignment. Her task? Buy 1,500 ecstasy pills, 1.5 ounces of cocaine, and a gun all at once from 2 seasoned drug dealers. For an untrained young woman with no background in law enforcement, it was a setup that seemed destined for disaster. As she drove toward the meeting spot, Rachel wore a wire. Detectives monitored her from a distance, promising they had everything under control. But what Rachel didn't know was that she had already been marked. The dealers grew suspicious. They searched her, and when they found the wire, everything unraveled. Within hours, Rachel was missing. Days later, her body would be found, discarded like evidence of a failed operation. This is not just a story of Rachel Hoffman's murder. It is a story of systemic failure, of innocence manipulated, of a life thrown into fire of a broken justice system. It's a story that forced an entire state to confront the consequences of using vulnerable young people as disposable pawns in the war on drugs. This is the case of Rachel Morningstar Hoffman. Before the headlines, before the tragedy, before she was reduced to a cautionary tale, Rachel Morningstar Hoffman was simply Rachel. Born on December 17, 1984, in Clearwater, Florida, Rachel grew up in a loving middle-class family. From a young age, she was known for her free-spirited personality. Friends remember her as the kind of person who lit up any room she entered. She was quirky, fun-loving, and always chasing the next adventure. Rachel wasn't perfect. No one is. But she had a deep love for people around her and for the simple joys of life. She adored animals, especially her beloved dog and her pet rabbit, which she often spoiled as though they were her children. She had a creative streak, experimenting with fashion and music. And when she moved to Tallahassee to attend Florida State University, Rachel felt like she was finally carving out her own path. At FSU, she pursued a degree in psychology. Her friends described her as intelligent, curious, and compassionate. Someone who listened without judgment and always tried to understand people. She was the type who could strike up a conversation with a stranger and leave them feeling like they had known her for years. But like many young adults, Rachel also stumbled. She dabbled with marijuana and occasionally used recreational drugs at parties. It wasn't unusual for students in Tallahassee's vibrant college scene, but in Rachel's case, it would eventually put her on the radar of law enforcement. Still, to her parents, to her friends, Rachel was just a normal 23-year-old. She had recently graduated, was figuring out her career path, and had an entire life ahead of her. Her mother, Margie Weiss, would later describe Rachel as bright, beautiful, and full of life, the kind of daughter any parent would be proud of. It's important to remember this side of Rachel, not the headlines, not the way her story ended, but the young woman with dreams, laughter, and an entire future waiting to unfold. And it makes the decisions that followed, the choices made by law enforcement, the danger she was placed in, all the more tragic. Because Rachel wasn't some hardened criminal. She wasn't a trained officer. She was just a young woman who got caught with marijuana, and in that moment of vulnerability, the system pulled her into a game she could never survive. It was spring of 2008. Rachel had just graduated from Florida State University, and like so many young adults, she was caught between the carefree rhythms of student life and the pressure to figure out what came next. But everything changed on May 7th, 2008, when Rachel was pulled over by police. In her car, officers discovered a small amount of marijuana and some prescription pills that weren't in her name. To most, It looked like a routine possession charge, the kind of case that could have led to probation, counseling, or at worst, a few years behind bars. But to Rachel, the arrest felt like the end of her world. She had never been in serious trouble before. The thought of a criminal record, of prison time, terrified her, and in that fear, police saw an opportunity. Instead of processing her like any other young person facing possession charges, investigators from the Tallahassee Police Department presented Rachel with what they called a deal. She could avoid prison if she agreed to work with them, not as an employee, not as a trainee, but as a confidential informant. To Rachel, who was panicked and desperate, it sounded like a lifeline, but in reality it was a trap. Confidential informants, often called CIs, are civilians recruited by police to help them make drug busts or gather intelligence. They're usually vulnerable, facing criminal charges themselves, and offer reduced sentences in exchange for cooperation. But unlike trained undercover officers, they receive no formal training, no real protection, and often no second chances. For police, it's a convenient system. They get an insider to walk into dangerous situations. If it works, they claim a victory in the war on drugs. If it doesn't, the consequences fall entirely on the informant. Rachel had no idea how dangerous the path ahead would be. She wasn't a cop. She wasn't armed. She wasn't trained to deal with seasoned dealers who lived and breathed suspicion and violence. Yet detectives assured her this was her way out, her chance to clear her name and move forward with her life. But what Rachel couldn't know, sitting in that interrogation room, was that she had just signed her own death sentence. Her very first assignment would not be a small transaction, a minor setup to test the waters. Instead, police sent her into the fire. A deal so large, so reckless, that even trained officers would have hesitated. Rachel's task: buy 1,500 ecstasy pills, 1.5 ounces of cocaine, and a gun. And she would have to do it alone. Rachel Hoffman's first, and only, assignment as a confidential informant wasn't just reckless. It was catastrophic by design. Police told her she needed to help them make a big bust. Not a minor drug handoff. Not a test run. But a massive transaction. 1,500 ecstasy pills, 1.5 ounces of cocaine, and a handgun. For seasoned detectives, this kind of buy would be considered high risk. But for Rachel, a 23-year-old with no training, no weapon, and no experience, it was nothing short of a death sentence. Still, she agreed. Why? Because the alternative, prison time, a criminal record, the shame of failure, weighed heavily on her shoulders. She trusted, in her fear and naivety, that the police knew what they were doing, that they would keep her safe. On the afternoon of May 7th, 2008, Rachel prepared for the operation. Detectives fitted her with a wire and equipped her with marked bills. They told her they would be monitoring everything. They promised backup would be nearby. And they reassured her, over and over again, that she had nothing to worry about. But there were already glaring problems. Police failed to follow standard protocol. They didn't properly control the meeting location. They maintained close surveillance. And perhaps worst of all, they underestimated the people Rachel was about to face. The dealers Rachel was instructed to meet weren't low-level street operators. They were Andrea Green and Deanery O'Reilly, seasoned criminals with violent histories. These were men who knew the drug game inside and out, and who trusted no one. Sending Rachel in to deal with them was like sending an amateur actress onto the stage of a Shakespearean tragedy, with the wrong script and no rehearsal. As Rachel drove toward the meeting point in her Volvo, detectives trailed at a distance. They told her they'd be watching closely, ready to move in if things went wrong. But in reality, they lost track of her almost immediately. Rachel arrived at the rendezvous point. She met Green and Riley. Nervous but determined, she followed instructions. Yet the men quickly grew suspicious. Something about Rachel didn't sit right. Maybe it was her hesitation. Maybe it was a wire she carried. Or maybe it was just instinct. As the deal progressed, Rachel disappeared from police surveillance. Her wire went silent. Hours passed. Officers lost visual contact, lost communication, lost everything. By the time they realized Rachel was in danger, she was already gone. The sun dipped below the Florida horizon as Rachel Hoffman sat in her car, waiting for the signal that would change everything. She was wired. She was nervous. And she was alone. The dealers, Andrea Green and Deanery O'Reilly, climbed into the car. They spoke in coded language, gauging her reactions. Every word, every pause carried weight. Rachel tried to play along, pretending she was just another buyer, but her nerves betrayed her. At first, the transaction seemed to move forward, but then suspicion crept in. Green and Riley began asking pointed questions. Who was she really? Why was she fumbling with the cash? Why did her story not quite add up? And then they found the wire. For Rachel, the moment must have been pure terror. The fragile cover she had been promised shattered instantly. To Green and Riley, she wasn't just a customer anymore. She was a threat, a snitch, and in their world, there was only one punishment for that. Police, meanwhile, were already losing control of the operation. They had allowed Rachel to drive off-route, without close surveillance. They had failed to maintain constant eyes on her car. When her wire went silent, panic set in. By the time officers realized what happened, Rachel was no longer anywhere they could reach. Green and Riley drove Rachel away. At some point during the night, her life ended. The details of those final moments remain chillingly unclear. But what is known is that Rachel was shot multiple times, her body discarded like evidence in a ditch miles away from Tallahassee. Days later, on May 9, 2008, investigators discovered her remains in a remote wooded area near Perry, Florida. She had been executed, not as a hardened criminal, but as a young woman coerced into playing a role she never should have been cast in. The official cause of death was multiple gunshot wounds. She was just 23 years old. When the news broke, it sent shockwaves through the community. Friends were devastated. Her family was shattered. And the public demanded answers. Why had a college graduate with no training been sent alone into the den of violent drug dealers? Rachel's death was not just the loss of an innocent life. It was the exposure of a system that had failed, a system that gambled with human lives in the name of arrests and statistics. But Rachel's story didn't end there. Her murder would set into motion trials, accountability battles, and even new laws. On May 9, 2008, 2 days after Rachel Hoffman vanished during the failed sting operation, the search came to a grim end. Her body was found in a remote, wooded area of Taylor County, about 50 miles southeast of Tallahassee. The discovery confirmed what many had feared. Rachel had been murdered. The autopsy would reveal the brutal truth. She had been shot multiple times. It was an execution, carried out swiftly, meant to silence her forever. For Rachel's parents, Margie Weiss and Irv Hoffman, the news was unbearable. Their daughter, the bright, free-spirited young woman they loved, was gone, taken not just by criminals, but by the very system that was supposed to protect her. The public's grief quickly turned into outrage. Local media began to uncover the shocking details of how Rachel, a 23-year-old with no training, had been pressured into working as a confidential informant, and not just for a minor case, but for a high-risk drug sting involving seasoned, violent dealers. Rachel's murder dominated headlines across Florida. Newspapers called it a botched operation and a deadly failure of law enforcement. Community members questioned how police could justify sending a young woman into such a dangerous situation alone. National networks soon picked up the story. Rachel's death was no longer just a local tragedy. It became a symbol of systemic failure in the war on drugs. In interviews, Rachel's parents spoke through tears. Her mother described her daughter as full of life, with so much ahead of her, while her father demanded accountability, asking, "How could they use my daughter this way? How could they throw her into something so dangerous?" The Tallahassee Police Department, under mounting pressure, defended its actions. Officials insisted Rachel had volunteered. They claimed she knew the risks. But for many, those excuses rang hollow. Because the truth was undeniable. Rachel wasn't a trained officer. She wasn't prepared. And she wasn't protected. Her death sparked a firestorm that would soon reach beyond her case. But first, justice had to be sought for the men who pulled the trigger. In the weeks following Rachel Hoffman's murder, investigators quickly identified the men responsible. Andrea Green and Deanery O'Reilly. Both were seasoned criminals with long records tied to drugs and violence. The evidence was clear. Rachel had been lured into a meeting under the guise of a drug buy, exposed as a confidential informant, and executed. Her cooperation with police, coerced, pressured, and reckless in its design, had cost her life. Green and Riley were arrested and charged with first-degree murder, armed robbery, and other related offenses. The trials were long and emotional. Prosecutors painted the picture of two hardened men who showed no mercy to a young woman caught in circumstances far beyond her control. They emphasized the brutality of Rachel's final moments, the cold-blooded decision to end her life. The defense tried to cast doubt, arguing about the logistics of the sting and raising questions about law enforcement's role. But the jury was unmoved. The facts were too damning. In 2010, Andrea Green was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison without parole. A year later, Deanery O'Reilly was also convicted and handed the same fate. For Rachel's family, the verdicts brought a measure of justice, but not closure. Her parents knew the men who pulled the trigger weren't the only ones responsible. Behind the bars and gavels, there lingered a far more troubling truth. Rachel's death could have been prevented. The Tallahassee Police Department faced intense criticism. Why had they used Rachel as a confidential informant for such a high-stakes deal? Why hadn't they provided proper backup? Why had they sent her in with men known to be violent and unpredictable? In press conferences, officials shifted responsibility. They claimed Rachel had volunteered, that she understood the risks. But to the public, and especially to Rachel's parents, these explanations sounded more like excuses than accountability. The outrage grew. Commentators, community leaders, and lawmakers began to demand change. The use of young, nonviolent offenders as disposable informants wasn't just reckless. It was deadly, and Rachel's case proved it. Her story was no longer just a tragedy. It was a catalyst, and it would lead to one of the most important reforms in Florida's criminal justice system, Rachel's Law. Rachel Hoffman's death didn't fade into silence. Her parents, Margie Weiss and Irv Hoffman, refused to let their daughter's story become just another statistic in the failed war on drugs. They wanted justice, not only for Rachel, but for every vulnerable young person who might be put in the same position. The public outrage that followed her murder lit a fire under lawmakers in Florida. The message was clear. What happened to Rachel could never happen again. Within a year, a groundbreaking piece of legislation was drafted. It would be called Rachel's Law. Signed by Florida Governor Charlie Crist in 2009, Rachel's Law created new standards for how police departments could recruit and use confidential informants. It required agencies to provide proper training for officers handling informants, to establish strict guidelines for when and how informants could be used, and, most importantly, to prohibit using individuals to infiltrate operations that were too dangerous for their level of experience. For Rachel's parents, the passing of this law was bittersweet. Nothing could bring their daughter back, but knowing that her story would protect others gave them a small measure of peace. Rachel's Law has since been referenced across the country as a model for reform. It stands as a reminder that informants are not disposable tools. They are human beings with lives, families, and futures. Even so, the questions linger. Critics argue that confidential informant programs remain risky, with many young people still coerced into dangerous assignments. Some believe Rachel's Law didn't go far enough. Others say it was a first step in a much-needed national reckoning. For Rachel's family, though, her legacy is more than legislation. It is a memory of who she was, a vibrant, quirky, kind-hearted young woman who should have been living her life, not die in a botched sting. Every year, on the anniversary of her death, friends and loved ones gather to honor her memory. They don't remember her as a statistic or as a victim, but as Rachel, the daughter, the friend, the dreamer who loved animals, music, and life itself. Her story continues to resonate because it's about more than one young woman. It's about the cost of a broken system, the weight of bad decisions, and the need for compassion over numbers in law enforcement. Rachel Hoffman's name is now a call to action, a reminder that behind every policy, every case, every statistic, there's a human life, and sometimes that life is cut tragically short. The story of Rachel Morningstar Hoffman is one that leaves us uneasy. It is a tragedy wrapped in injustice, framed by choices that were never hers to make. On May 7th, 2008, she was just a 23-year-old woman caught with marijuana. In a just system, that moment might have been a setback, but not a death sentence. Instead, police turned her mistake into leverage. They promised her a way out. They promised her a clean slate. What they delivered was a mission doomed from the start. Rachel was not a hardened criminal. She was not trained, not prepared, not protected. She was a young woman whose life was gambled away in a reckless sting operation. When the dealers discovered her wire, they silenced her forever. Her murder shattered more than one family. It exposed the dangers of a system that treats informants as expendable. It raised questions about accountability, about justice, and about the value placed on human life. Rachel's parents have carried this weight every day since. Their fight for Rachel's law gave her story meaning beyond tragedy. But for them, the pain never truly ends. A daughter was stolen, a future erased, a life reduced to a cautionary tale. As we reflect on Rachel's story, we are forced to ask, how many more? How many young people are still pressured, coerced, or manipulated into becoming informants in dangerous cases? How many of them will never come home? The haunting truth is this. Rachel trusted the system, and the system betrayed her. Her story is not just about a crime, or even about a law. It's about the thin line between innocence and horror, about how quickly life can be undone when justice loses its humanity. Rachel Morningstar Hoffman will always be remembered, not as a confidential informant, not as a statistic, but as a daughter, a friend, and a life that mattered. And that is the truth we must carry forward.